All right, we're going to pick up where we left off with that last video. So we had just talked about Stalin's ascent all the way to about the death of Lenin. So the death of Lenin takes place in 1924, and this is could be a much more complicated story. There's much more involved, but we're going to keep it kind of short and simple. But although probably if you're a betting man, you probably would not have put your money on Stalin unless you really had some insider information about what Stalin's really like and the other leading contenders. For example, Trotsky. Probably most people had the smart money on Trotsky. But Stalin, I mentioned him being very good at using systems and manipulating people, and he was. And so through a whole string of changing allies, he's able to sideline Trotsky, because Trotsky is the number one heir apparent to Lenin, is able to eventually sideline him and ally himself with other powerful Bolshevik leaders, and gradually, again, marginalize Trotsky. Trotsky, I think, is overconfident in his brilliance and his talents. I think he looked down on Stalin, and maybe his arrogance and overconfidence was Trotsky's undoing, because Stalin knows what he's doing, and he's outmaneuvering Trotsky. Trotsky also, I think, did not have a lot of friends. I think Trotsky, again, his arrogance and brilliance turned off a lot of people. So he did not have a lot of friends in the Bolshevik Party, and Stalin sure knows how to make use of that. So, long story short, by 1928, Stalin is the undisputed leader of the Communist Party. And he begins to launch a series of five-year plans starting in 1927 to jumpstart Russia into a modern industrial country, the modern agriculture and industry. Part of the reason for that is Stalin feared that the Western world was against communism and against him, which he's not wrong about a lot of that, and fears that the only way communism, I should say, it senses the only way communism survives and thrives is with Russia dramatically industrializing and strengthening itself economically. So he embarks on a very aggressive campaign to do just that. Additionally, he is a committed Marxist. And where Lenin had backed off of war communism, and had Lenin, by the way, because he had to, because Russia was in an economic and social crisis, Lenin had backed off on the idea of collectivizing farms and so forth. By the time Stalin is coming into power, Stalin decides to fulfill the, I don't know if Marxist, but certainly Bolshevik, in some degree, I guess, what Marxist playbook by bringing privately controlled farmland under the collective control of the state and the Russian people as he sees it. And that leads to what's called collectivization of agriculture. Additionally, Stalin, fearing that, I don't know if they call them wealthy, but some way well-to-do, to some degree prosperous peasants who have been able to revive their fortunes during or following Lenin's abandonment of war communism, that these fairly well-to-do peasants, some of which who own their own land, are not going to be excited about collectivization. And by the way, you can see why. If you worked your tail off and eventually acquired a little bit of wealth, not necessarily wealth, but a little bit of wealth through your hard work on a piece of land, you have worked your tail to the bone to develop, maybe even bought a little bit of property, starting to feel a little bit glimpse of economic prosperity and doing pretty well. We refer to that, by the way, those farm owners as kulaks. Stalin feels that they would be ultimately opposed to collectivization. Again, probably not wrong about that. And so he views them as a major impediment that has to be eliminated. Stalin, by the way, is not particularly interested even in winning them over. Stalin views any bringing them over to communism as probably a failed project. They've made their bed. They're capitalist at heart. They're not part of what the new Russia is going to be, or I should say the new Marxist Russia or a new Marxist world is going to be, and the kulaks simply need to go. And when I say need to go, means whether they starve to death or they're shot, whatever they or exiled to Siberia, whatever the case may be, as a class within Marxist Russia or the Soviet Union, that the kulak class in its entirety has to be eliminated, and effectively does just that. Some scholars have argued this is an outright policy of genocide. Genocide is the elimination whole or in part of a religious ethnic class group, and I think this would fit that. I heard a professor from Stanford here, probably a good 10 years ago, lecturing at CSU Stanislaus, talked about just this, that he said this is technically meets the definition of genocide, that Stalin decides to eliminate an entire class from Russian society, and that class is the relatively well-off peasants. Again, many of them, some are just shot outright. If they're not shot, some of them are exiled to Siberia and are worked to death or left to starve, all their food's taken from them. Whatever the case may be, they are removed. The total numbers of collectivization, it's hard to know exactly, but the total butcher's bill, and that's the right term for collectivization, is probably around 10 million people die. Now, some of those, again, are collectivized outright with a bullet. Others of them have the food taken away, and others of them are a natural consequence of what turns out to be a terrible idea. Not only is collectivization brutal for the Kulak class that are eliminated through a genocidal policy from Stalin, but if any of you, and we essentially live in the Great Central Valley, we know this, agriculture is local, and might be even local to your farm, but part of collectivization is they don't trust the peasants. They want to make sure the peasants, all the food is taken by the state. And so they don't want peasants being able to harvest kind of behind their back and perhaps keep a little bit, to sell a little bit or control a little bit. They don't want that. They want to make sure that when we harvest, that they know where all the grain is and they can collect it all. And so collectivization involves incredibly short-sighted policies where people have known nothing about farming. For example, telling the whole region, we're going to harvest on a certain date. They'll pick a day out in the calendar. We're going to harvest August 25th. Well, and that for the whole region, we're all harvesting on exactly the same day. Well, that's not how agriculture works well, right? Depends. Maybe your field's not ready. Now, maybe your neighbor's field is ready to go on the 25th, but your field is not. Stalin, though, that's not his interest. And so his regional managers told you I collect all the grain, etc. And it leads oftentimes to agricultural disaster. They harvest too soon, it's not ready to harvest. They harvest too late, and the crop is already past its prime. A lot of unnecessary wastage, foolishness of these, frankly, idiotic agricultural policies leads to starvation. You guys know the Holodomor from the lecture on Ukraine. I'll talk about that here briefly in a minute. But that's just one consequence. There's also famines in other parts of Russia and just frankly very poor crop yields from the foolish system of collectivization as early on implemented, and it leads to a terrible death toll. Yes, higher than the Holocaust that we're so familiar with World War II, 10 million. Probably is a good number there. See some examples of that. In this case, the Young Communist League, they're on the left, looking for grain that's been hidden, that being the Ukraine, by the way. So as you guys know, a lot of this is from Ukraine, but it's not just Ukraine. The famine takes place in other places within Russia as well, too. Now, I'm not going to spend time on the Holodomor because we talked about this quite a bit in previous lecture. I just want you to know that's going on as a consequence of collectivization, both in Russia but also in Ukraine. Now, as you know, and I'm not going to go into this, Ukraine's specific because Stalin is using perhaps a natural, when I say natural, is artificially, foolishly created food shortage with collectivization, and then Stalin also weaponizing what he caused by this foolish planning and mandated system of agriculture, but he's also doubling down to use that as a way to target Ukrainian opponents, as you guys know. But I'm going to fast forward past that, just as a reminder, as you guys know, the numbers, that terrible time and in Ukraine, and it's not limited to only Ukraine. Ukraine it's the worst there because again Stalin chooses it to be, but other places in Russia have famine as well too. All right, so leaving that aside, now Stalin does have, to give him appropriate due in some ways, he does have some success in hurling Russia into its status as an industrial power. He's very ambitious. The goal's out there, and I would say one of the strong points of communism is for those who are true believers, they do throw a lot of energy into this new Marxist world as a utopia they're heading toward. That means hard work, a vision that you're working for the greater good. And so there is a certain level of natural enthusiasm on the parts of some Russians or those in the Russian Empire to participate in these grand enterprises. Also, you can force people. So if they don't do it enthusiastically, you just force them. And so Russia does take on a whole series of grand projects of one kind or another. And to some degree, this rigid labor discipline and so forth, national focus, does assist Russian agricultural and industrial production. Additionally, the Russians do hire a lot of foreign experts, engineers, and so forth, technicians to come to Russia who have the expertise that Russia does not have to help these grand enterprises get going, whether it's a new tractor factory, a new power station, new dam, bridges, infrastructure, new steel plant, etc. They hire foreign experts to come in that work for good money, and then you have a local population either coerced because they have to or enthusiastically to participate, and Russia does make major strides. Let's talk about life in the Soviet paradise under Stalin. Now let's get with the positives first. I mentioned idealism. Again, this vision of a bright future that humanity is heading toward, and Russia is at the vanguard. They're at the front, right? They're the shock troops of this fantastic world utopia that is just being born. Now they're going through a lot of struggles because the world, as they see, is resistant to it. The capitalist nations of Europe and the United States and others are opposing them because they're decadent and controlled by the bourgeoisie and so forth. But they feel like, again, they're on the right side of history, the scientific side of history, the progress side of history. Additionally, in Stalin's Russia, for the most part, people are employed. Now, remember, part of this time period in the 1930s, 1920s into the 30s, especially the early 30s, the world's going through, as you guys know, the Great Depression. Ironically, because it's so disconnected from the world economy, for the most part, Stalin's Russia is able to avoid the Great Depression. I'm not saying it had no effect on them, but they're not particularly plugged in with the Western banking system, so that's not really affecting them. So Russia is, for the most part, spared the worst ravages of the Great Depression. Of course, by the way, to a lot of the pride of the Russians, as you can imagine. They're like, look what the capitalist system doing. It's burning itself down in the United States and in Western Europe. But we in Russia are immune to that because we have a Marxist system of the people being in charge, and we don't have the insanity of the capitalist system. I mentioned that largely immune. The Great Depression, social benefits, again, to some degree, this is there. For example, old age pensions, free medical care, free education, free daycare. Now, again, the quality is given very widely, but at least in theory and sometimes in reality, those things do exist. So for some Russians, they would see that as a sign of progress. For example, like the free daycare, free education. There's a possibility for personal advancement. If you're talented and good, there's a good chance you may be promoted. If you're part of the Bolshevik or Communist Party in Russia, also you can advance politically if you're part of that and do well. Also, the communists promise gender equality. Now, again, that's probably more in theory. In reality, for example, there's no women and there's no highly placed women in Stalin's government. But in some fields, though, you do have a certain level of gender advancement better than it had been in the past. So, for example, female scientists, engineers, etc., probably professions that they could not have gone into 20, 30, 40 years ago. But in the communist world, again, in theory, there's gender equality, so there is greater scope for some women to pursue, for example, becoming a medical doctor or whatever they choose to do. There's a greater range of things that they can do in a communist state than they would have done in a more traditional czarist Russia, that's for sure. Racial equality. Now, again, this is more in theory than in reality, but in theory, Marx sees no racial differences that should matter to a true Marxist. And again, to some degree, there is some truth to this, that the communists do rail against the racism of other regions. For example, in the United States, that'd be a good example too. And the communists are quick to criticize that and say, in a communist-controlled country, those things would not exist. Now, was Stalin's Russia racial equity paradise? It was not. But I would say for that era, I suppose it was progressive. This last one I mentioned this already, ability of the state to undertake and achieve tremendous goals by united action. Yeah, they did, because they don't have a choice, right? So if Russia's going to build some massive dam or canal, you simply conscript the people to do it. They don't have a choice. You're going to do it. So Russia does achieve some big projects. Now, is it as efficient as it could be? No. Is the human cost high? Yes. But they are able to do some big kind of dramatic projects. Now, I think could they be done more efficiently and less loss of life in a well-run system in the Western Europe, United States? I think undoubtedly that's true. Undoubtedly. But Russia does, because again, they can of course make it happen. They do achieve and envision some big project they're going to do, and they're able to do it. Okay, that's all the positive. Let's get to the negatives. Poor standard of living. So the promise of economic equality, that equality so far means poverty for many. Now, again, you might have a job. So I suppose in some ways it's better than being dirt poor in the czarist world where you're unemployed. You probably do have some access to some kind of job in the communist system. But in general, standard of living is quite poor, and it's not changing. Now, for the party faithful, life is better for them, but for the average Russian citizen, it's not good. There's no civil rights, no property rights, no religious practice outlawed. There's a major lack of housing, lack of information about what is really happening, because, of course, Stalin's party, the Communist Party, controls all media, so you don't really know what's going on. Shifting sands of party politics, yeah. Even you being a devoted Bolshevik or communist is not enough to keep you safe, as we'll see here when we get to the Great Purge. Even if you're a deeply loyal Communist Party member, that may not be enough to protect you. It is a police state, undoubtedly. Executions, there's separation of powers. There's no due process in court system, so if you're accused of a crime, good luck. Terrible famines, as you guys know. Many arbitrary government measures are simply imposed on the people. For millions, one form of death or another, through starvation, execution, or work to death. Again, we're not talking small numbers, we're talking millions. Now, there are winners and losers. Some do well in Stalin's Russia. If you're part of the Communist Party and you're able to keep your head down and no one denounces you and you get through all the purges, life, I suppose, can be good for you. For the average Russian, though, it's going to be a mixed bag. You really have to interview them probably person by person how it's been for them. Some of them still are holding on to the faith that although life is difficult, we're heading to a glorious Marxist utopia. Life is hard now, but that's how life works out. You know, you put in the hard work now, and it gets better and better later. For other Russians, it's a mixed bag. For other Russians, it's an absolute nightmare that ends in their death and death of their loved ones. Let's move on to Stalin's cult of personality. So I'll make this kind of short. We could spend, it's such a fascinating topic and a scary topic too. But we'll briefly touch on this. So Stalin's cult personality, you see the subtitle there, unquestioning veneration of an idealized leader, suspension of individual thought, and reality distortion gives great power and protection to the leader. So the first part is unquestioned veneration of an idealized leader, and you can see a visual example of that. These adoring wide range of ethnic groups in Russia, which Russia does have quite a few different ethnic groups. Looking at Stalin, you see he's above them, and this kind of glorious scene. You see this adoring eye of men, women, and children all giving him the twinkly eye of affection, near level of deity. See, they're all giving him flowers, the father of the Soviet Union. And you guys read some of this for class. You guys read that piece by A.O. Avdyenko, The Cult of Stalin. And that poetry there, "O great Stalin, the leader of the people, thou who broughtest man to birth, thou who fructest the earth." I didn't know fructus is a word, but to make fruit grow. "Thou who restorest the centuries, thou who makest bloom the spring, thou who makest vibrant the musical chords, Thou splendor of my spring, O thou sun, reflected by millions of hearts. I don't know if you guys are tearing up at home listening to that, but just this over-the-top propaganda. You guys read that piece, that follow-on piece by Yevgeny Yevtushenko, Literature's Propaganda. I'm talking about all these artists, writers, thinkers, poets, all being coerced to promote this cult of Stalin. And what's the point of the cult of Stalin? The point, of course, is this veneration for this idealized Messiah-like leader gives tremendous power and protection to that leader. Like this doesn't happen for no reason, right? There's an explicit reason. It's very good for Stalin's power, for the Communist Party in general, as viewed by Stalin. So, for example, you see suspension of individual thought, because the great leader knows. You don't need to have your opinion. Maybe collectivization doesn't seem to be working too good to you. Maybe you see you have almost nothing to eat, but Stalin's told you it's okay. Stalin's the father of the people, and so maybe things are hard right now, but he's told you it's okay and what needs to happen. He's asking for you to sacrifice. And he's right. He knows all. So you don't know. He knows. He's leading Russia into the future, and you're part of that army leading the future. He's got to be right. By the way, you can see how this in some ways would be appealing, right? This, as human beings, we like a higher power that knows what they're doing. If you don't have a God, remember that the Soviet system is atheistic, the communist system is atheistic, you don't have a higher power to appeal to. So if you're having a bad day, I'm not saying they pray to Stalin, they're not doing that, but if you feel that Stalin is a higher power that's taking you to better places and loves the Russian people and is brilliant and has this almost like divine level guidance in the decision he makes, you're going to feel better. You don't have a God to pray to, but you have this brilliant, all-seeing genius in command that is taken. You can see better than you can and see more clearly than you can. And he's told you he knows where he's going, where he's taking Russia. So maybe you don't understand it, but he does. That's all you need to know, and you can rest well at night, put your head in the pillow, sleep the sleep of peace, because you know Stalin's got your back and the back of the Russian people. Your life has purpose and value because you're serving the great leader as he brings about this utopia. What a fantastic way to eliminate dissent. Because if the leader's right for you to be dissenting, how dare you as an individual? You know what you're talking about. Stalin knows all things. And you, how dare you, with your limited perspective, to question what he's doing, to raise your hand and say, I disagree with this, or I'm bothered by this, or I'm uncomfortable with this. No. Stalin's right. The background is cult of personality. This didn't come from nowhere, of course, right? So you go to the ancient world, as you guys know, and you had a whole series of things from the ancient world that in some ways relate as a precursor to the cult of personality. Back in ancient Egypt, as you guys probably well aware, oftentimes ancient Egyptians and Near Eastern kings are viewed as living gods. Again, how can you say no to a god, a living god? In the Roman world, Emperor Augustus, starting with his life, actually Julius Caesar a little bit, but probably most famously Emperor Augustus, following his death, they made him a deified individual, built temples to him. That was going on a little bit even in his lifetime. Now, he was a smart politician. He would not claim deification during his lifetime. Augustus Caesar's too smart for that. But he would take on these glowing attributes and biographies that made him sound like unquestionably a man chosen by the gods to lead and protect and bring prosperity to Rome. And he would pay these and be a patron of these poets and authors who are putting this stuff out, because this is an imperial cult. Again, because it means authority. It means, how dare you question someone chosen by the gods to run Rome? He's blessed by the gods. You got to trust him. You got to follow him. It'd be morally wrong for you not to. That picture in the middle is the Sassanid Empire today, and would be primarily Iran, but showing the god there giving the king his royal authority to rule. The god's here on the right, king there's on the left, giving the royal authority to rule. Again, that means like a godlike endorsement of who you are. And on the right there, that's Charles I, King of England, and you can see a divine hand giving him his crown. And apparently, looks like he's high in that painting, or going to sleep. But that's not. He's getting the juice from God, the power from God himself. Again, so if the king has this divine right to rule, who are you to question the king? He's God's instrument on earth. That is tremendous authority. It's a mystical, mysterious, spiritual level of power that you have to bow down to and to obey if you're a good citizen. So in a lot of ways, the cult of personality is borrowing from these, but just in the modern world and the communist system. Even borrowing some from Tsarist Russia. The Tsar, of course, is venerated by many Russians, not a deity, but certainly blessed by God, the father of the people. And Stalin, actually Lenin kind of initially got this going, but Stalin also taps in it in a much later, greater way that Stalin does this, taps into this perhaps desire among some citizens, plus the usefulness of the cult of personality for his own protection, his own power magnification. It's very useful to him. That means Stalin's image is everywhere. As you guys saw from your textbook, he's in print. His name's put on cities, statues, paintings, etc., extolling the brilliance, wisdom of Stalin. Now, Stalin is smart. He's always saying, I'm the successor of Lenin. You see that on that poster there on the right, you see Lenin behind him. Stalin's very careful to say Lenin was the great captain. I'm simply following in Lenin's footsteps. But of course, you notice, though, Lenin is kind of this removed icon, right? Well, he's dead, so it makes sense. But Stalin now is a living embodiment of this continuation of the vision of Marx and Engels and Lenin and now Stalin. And the veneration of Stalin as this great captain taken in the future. So why is this significant? And let me highlight this for you guys. You got this down. This toxic manipulation of reality. The reason why it's toxic, of course, right, is Stalin is no genius, although he's intelligent, capable. And some of the things he does, as you guys know, end in absolute inhumane disaster for millions. But of course, if the great leader, you can't bring those things up. It'd be wrong for you even to discuss those things. Well, fatal, besides just being fatal, but even people around you might not want to hear it. Because Stalin's the great leader. Stalin's taken Russia to a great place. And for you to criticize him, what is wrong with you? So it's that toxic manipulation of reality that you're not even allowed to really see the reality that's taking place, to discuss the reality of place. You simply have to salute as a good communist in Russia and do your job and put your faith that Stalin knows better than you, not slightly, infinitely better than you. And if you don't understand that, then fear can work too. Now, cult of personality is to bring veneration. So it's the other side of doing it out of fear, because some Russians are going to do it out of fear. That's coming up here a little bit. But this is to bring a positive, no, it's not positive, but I mean by that is to bring affection, idealism of the Russian people and pour all those hopes, aspirations, probably naivete, all that, pour that into all these hopes into one individual, in this case, Stalin. You can see that in this depiction here of this gathering. You see Marx, of course, that's Engels, that's Lenin, and there's Stalin. And Stalin, of course, is the successor everyone's pinning their hopes on in the communist system. Now, of course, Russia is not unique. They have a cult of personality under Stalin. This is in China. That's Mao Zedong right here, and all these young, fervent Red Guards, if you remember Chinese history, and carrying the saying of Mao's little red book. Absolute cult of personality. Certainly in the Nazi system, Hitler absolutely cultivated a cult of personality as well. You see depicted in that artwork. North Korea, tragically, and that's contemporary North Korea, of course, the great leader, although Kim Il-sung's been dead for a while now, and already his grandson's running, Kim Jong-un. But Kim Jong-un, and all the way back to his grandfather, ran the absolute cult of personality in North Korea. Every single house in North Korea has to have a portrait of the great helmsman, and it has to be a portrait in a prominent, respected place in the house. You're very respectful of that portrait, and I mean every house. So if you're North Korea, you must, in your house, probably the living room, nicest room in the house, you have to have a nice framed portrait of the great leader. Actually, probably, and his grandson, too. The biographies put out by the official North Korean propaganda ministry, or they would call themselves propaganda, but news, some of the outlandish biographical tidbits they put about these leaders make them really a divine level figure. Brilliant, athletic, smart, inventive, creative, you name it, they've done it all because, again, they're essentially a deity. The downside of all that is North Korea is no paradise, as you guys are well aware. North Korea is a tragic place. We're talking right now, they're facing hunger shortages again. Surprise. When you have the rigidly controlled system, you could not be surprised over and over and over again for famine and problems to break out. It's the most isolated country in the world, as you guys know. It's an Orwellian police state of dysfunction, pain, and loss for many, many millions of North Koreans. It's a terrible, sad situation. Now, obviously, there are some winners there. If you're part of the Communist Party of North Korea, your life may be relatively good. Not free, but relatively good. You may be part of the power establishment. And for millions and millions of North Koreans, though, life remains grindingly difficult. No freedom of movement, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of thought. They live in a police state. But the core personality is there to reassure you all is fine. And there's a temptation. Now, you guys see some of Americans are not immune to this. No, we've never had, obviously, anything even approaching to Stalin's cult of personality in America, per se. But, we've had leaders that have got tremendous popularity, and I'd argue some of their fans or supporters, to some degree, have tapped into a certain level of veneration, admiration, and suspension of individual intellectual or moral thought that would border on a cult of personality for those individuals. The difference, of course, the United States, we're a free country. And so while you might have some people, followers, I'd say, voluntarily becoming a member, kind of a cult of personality for this or that politician or leader, whether that be a cult or a political leader, since we're a free country, they don't have the apparatus state to really make a cult personality like you see in the dictatorship or totalitarian state like Stalin's Russia or Hitler's Germany, or today's North Korea as well, too. But that human desire to have an all-powerful leader that you could trust in, that dealing with your grievances, your anger, your hopes, and you put all your faith in him or her, and you suspend your own individual moral and intellectual judgment. Whatever they say, you buy. You don't allow any other aspect of reality to intrude upon your ongoing veneration of that person. That is not unique to the world. It can happen here, too. It's a danger. There's a classic novel by Sinclair Lewis called It Can't Happen Here, talking in general about the same thing, which is, could America have a dictator? He wrote that book in the early 30s, and his answer is yes. Now, it's a fictional book by Sinclair Lewis, but it became a classic when it came out and remains still probably disturbingly prescient or a warning to the future that, yes, America does not have a history of this per se of cult of personality, but that appeal of a charismatic, talented, populist leader, and for his or her followers to embrace them to a certain degree as a voluntary cult of personality, yes. And how dangerous that could be for the nation, yes. Sinclair Lewis' book remains a warning to all of us. All right. I'm going to give you guys some examples here and some suggestions for you. So Lev Kopelev, who you guys have read here in your textbook, in this case, in the Ukraine, one of the first readings you guys did early on about the Ukraine and collectivization of the Ukraine. Lev Kopelev is significant because he was a very deeply committed Bolshevik communist. And you know that when he's talking about seeing requisition of Ukraine, grain in the Ukraine, that which rhymes, but it's not funny because it's called Ukraine, but food stocks and wheat or whatever is being taken from the peasants, and seeing these terrible scenes of privation and despair and death. But at the time when he sees these, as you guys read, and this dialed memory back to start of the semester, Lev Kopelev is like, but it's for a good cause. So yeah, these scenes are kind of hard to watch, but I'm a committed communist, and so you have to break some eggs to make an omelet. And so here in the Ukraine are having to break some eggs. It's not so easy to watch. It's kind of a little heartrending, but you know, it's any great enterprise takes sacrifice and the loss of some lives. Sometimes necessary. These people are probably enemies of the revolution in any case, and so I'm okay with it at the time. Now, eventually, Lev Kopelev, by the way, not right away, but as the many years roll by and as he eventually becomes increasingly bothered with what he sees and gets sent into exile in Siberia, eventually he breaks with communism and realizes, I've been brainwashed. I was so committed myself. I participated and witnessed many things, but eventually becomes a deeply committed dissident who attacks the inhumanity of Stalinism and communism and writes a classic book called The Education of a True Believer, in which he lays out, again, we just talked about, that he was a deeply committed Bolshevik communist, deeply committed, and that he participated in many things that you and I would find perhaps horrific or inhumane, the Holodomor in Ukraine, for example. But he thought, look, I'm just simply doing my duty. We're in a war. It's a war to bring the Marxist revolution to humanity. And so we have to fight that war. That means sometimes some people have to suffer. But those people who are suffering mostly are people who are resistant to this revolution. These are bad people. And ultimately, as you guys know from that classic book in which you guys read in class, he turns a very strong gaze at the reality of the inhumanity of how communism expressed under Stalin, and becomes a very strong critic of communism late in life. And there he is as a young man. He'd be a true believer here, and late in life, when he's becoming a very strong dissident and spoke out strongly against communism and what Stalin had been doing. All right. So we're getting toward the end. There's a couple more topics here before we wrap this up. So the new terror. So Stalin, from 1936 to 1938, launches what's called the Great Purge, and where Stalin and his henchmen and the NKVD and his security apparatus goes after many of his old Bolshevik fellow early revolutionaries. Additionally, going after current Communist Party members and anyone who is or could be perceived as a possible threat, and they are in many cases executed, in some cases sit to long prison terms. It took place from 1936 to 38 because it is a very aggressive campaign. So again, old Bolsheviks, many of them who he knew during the heyday of the early revolution, prior to the revolution, the party faithful, army officers, intellectuals, artists, writers, scientists, etc. Many across the spectrum of Russia are arrested, and many of them end up with a bullet in the back of the head. The numbers, perhaps around 8 million in Russia, are arrested. Now keep in mind, these on the whole, the vast majority of these are not capitalist or bourgeois opponents of communism. The vast majority of these have made their peace with the Bolshevik or communist revolution. Many of them are former Bolshevik members themselves or members of the Communist Party, which in some ways makes the Great Purge such an odd thing to do, that you are purging people within your own party. And I suppose dictators will always have a bit of paranoia, and it's not unusual for them to maintain very tight control of the party, eliminate parts of the party. But thinking back historically, prior to this, I can't think of many other rulers and dictators that with this same level of suspicion and probably paranoia that decimate so many of the in-group within their own party. Now, some of these had expressed some opposition to things Stalin was doing. So there's individuals in this who have expressed some opposition. But I would reckon the vast majority of them have not expressed opposition. But in one way or another, Stalin views them as compromised, or potentially could be compromised and safer to get rid of them. Let me give you some examples of what we're talking about. So, and by the way, what's kicking this off? So Sergei Kovarov, and you guys saw this in the video on Stalin, right? He's a close friend, associate of Stalin. He's also, as you guys saw, a rival of Stalin, potentially, is assassinated in December 1934. Now, again, we don't know the whole story. The assassin was arrested and executed. There's been some rumors and thoughts by some that Stalin himself was behind this assassination because Kirov, although very close to him, also as posing a potential threat to Stalin's power. I don't know. We will ever know the conclusive answer to this. Excuse me. It's been a long, busy day. Whatever the case may be, whether Stalin's behind it or some other, whatever the case may be, Stalin responds to this with the mechanism of the Great Purge. Now, that was in December 34. The Great Purge that we know did not really get going until 1936. But it does seem like this is a major triggering event for Stalin, whether he manufactured it or he simply is responding to with his friend and rival being assassinated. There's Kirov there. But I want to show you guys something related to Ukrainian history. There on the right was a statue in a Ukrainian city of Kirov. And there's in many places, Ukraine being part of the Soviet Union, whether it wanted to or not, but it's part, right? So there's many statues of Lenin and Stalin and so forth distributed throughout Ukraine, trying to get Russified Ukraine, being Ukrainian even more into the communist enterprise. And that is a statue of Kirov there in Ukraine. Now, if you keep reading in the little caption here, you'll notice that when independence arrived in Ukraine, that statue of Kirov came down, as in many other statues in Ukraine of Stalin and so forth also come down Ukraine with independence. Because again, that is not their story, and they know that this is an attempt by Moscow and the Communist Party to implement this kind of universal Marxist vision on Ukraine, but also part of it is to control Ukraine and to assimilate it into Russia being the center, and Ukraine is simply a province within Russia. So that statue of Kirov, as you guys see here on the right, was taken down. Famously, many of the revolutionaries who were close to Stalin are executed. There's all kinds of very famous photograph. You guys probably seen this before that shows Yezhov, a young man walking next to Stalin. Doing a little editing as we on the fly here as we go. And then during the Great Purge, Yezhov is executed. It's going to look kind of bad. That you can see that he was big in the earlier days, part of the core of the revolution, and we will just, with the Guadalatat, was airbrushed him out of history. Symbolic, of course, of the purge in general, and they airbrushed him out. These are mugshots of various Russian intellectuals. The guy on the left was a botanist who was arrested during the Great Purge. He had not spoken out against Stalin. There was an enemy rival botanist. We all like to imagine scientists are all about science, but they're people. A rival botanist that did not like Vavilov's, I'm not sure I pronounced his name correctly, did not like his interpretation of a biological event. They're big rivals, and his colleague / rival over science denounces this botanist. He's done nothing wrong. He's not spoken out against the revolution. He's in good standing in the Soviet Union, but he's been denounced. And in this hurricane of accusations that Stalin endorsed, and many of those he really targets individuals, oftentimes there's quotas sent to cities and regions, and so the death toll is high. Some of these have nothing to do with any potential disloyalty. It simply is a personal problem you have with someone, and that person is denounced. And in the rush to eliminate these enemies of the parties, enemies of the revolution, enemies of Stalin, many innocent people are caught up in this and executed or exiled. I want you guys to do the Moscow Sow trials. Now, for very prominent old Bolsheviks or others, for probably a whole host of reasons, Stalin decides we're going to have some high-profile trials. And again, maybe he felt like he had to because some of these are very famous old revolutionaries. So it's not going to be simply easy to arrest them and say execute them. People are going to ask questions. So you have to have some legitimate basis to execute them, in theory. Hold on. Let me make this. I think I can. There we go. That's better. Well, is that better? Okay. Maybe. Okay. Maybe. In any case. So these show trials are used to Stalin to publicly explain why these old war horses of revolution, these fellow Bolshevik leaders and so forth, could be generals, intellectuals, politicians, writers, poets, etc., scientists, why they need to be executed. And it would probably, again, look bad if you execute so many of them. There's no explanation. That might just look like raw tyranny. Stalin does not want that. And so they have a whole series of these show trials for the most high profile, in which they come there and they confess. And I believe in these show trials, every major person who's accused, with the exception of maybe one or two, all confess during the trial. Why they confess? Sometimes they're promised more lenient treatment if they confess, whereas if they don't confess, maybe they go after their family. It's quite common for Stalin and NKVD to not only assault, sometimes torture, frequently torture the person who's being accused to get them to admit to some crime, oftentimes a crime that's completely manufactured and it's not real. Okay, there we go. Or I lost my train of thought tinkering with the screen there. To get them to confess to some kind of crime. The most common crimes are working with Trotsky. Trotsky's already been exiled in this time period, that you're some kind of exile against Trotsky. That you are aligned with Trotsky and his criticism of Stalin and Stalinism, or that you're working with some reactionary movement against the Bolshevik system, whatever the case may be. There's some kind of a protest, some kind of movement against Stalin, his power. Oftentimes it's broader than that. It's against revolution itself. And these people are forced in these confessions. On the right there, that's Zinoviev, who was a leading Bolshevik. You can see the condition, what he looks like in prison. He will be executed. Now, he's a well-known Bolshevik. It's not easy in a sense to take the people down. But when he in his own show trial admits to plotting against revolution, plotting with Trotsky, whatever, to bring down Stalin's communist revolution, working against Leninism, we execute these people because they're traitors. And in court, in the show trial, it is a show, in the show, he plays his part by agreeing to the charges against him. And then he's executed. Oftentimes, their family is threatened. So if the physical torture is not enough to get you to confess, they also go after your family. Like, look, not only are you going to be tortured, but there's a good chance your family's not going to escape either. So you can spare all of us that by writing down this confession and giving us more names. Who do you know that could be involved in this? Again, the vast majority of the time, the charges are completely fabricated. Now, occasionally there is some dissent against Stalin, but usually they magnify that into treason. It doesn't take dissent and magnify into treason. But a lot of the time, it simply is completely manufactured, completely baseless accusations. Many of these people are deeply committed members of the Communist Party, ironically, but they're being executed. Because Stalin fears that perhaps these old Bolsheviks could be critical of him because they were there at the formation. Maybe they knew Lenin as well. They disagree with Stalin's interpretation of Marxism. Perhaps they view that Lenin himself would not have followed the path that Stalin currently is. Stalin likely is afraid of these issues and may think these people who know him and know his background might be effective critics of himself and decides it's not safe, we're going to limit these people. I'll give you a couple more examples of this. Nikolai Bukharin, who's depicted right here, and you guys also saw him briefly in the video you guys watched on Stalin, was a very popular Marxist politician, philosopher, economist, and author. Well-liked, had a very charismatic personality. That photograph is a wonderful photograph showing him in a sea of very happy faces. Often you don't associate that many smiles with communist Russia. But he's very charismatic. I said probably beloved by many of them. I had a lot of friends. You don't think of the Bolsheviks as having maybe a warm personality, but from all accounts, that's the case for him. Now, he's a Bolshevik. Does not mean he doesn't agree with what the Bolsheviks have done. The Bolsheviks, as you guys know, are no kinder, gentler party. They were okay with using violence from the get-go. But within that spectrum, Bukharin is perhaps one of the brightest personalities and well-loved by many. But Bukharin, maybe anyway, good for him, seen some of the excesses that Stalin's involved in, for example, collectivization and other things. Bukharin is bothered by the death toll of Stalin's interpretation of Leninism and communism. And Bukharin, not publicly so much, but he does level some criticism against Stalin, and that, of course, proves fatal during the purge. He is arrested, as you guys saw in the video, forced to sign confessions, which he only partially does because he also says, "I love the revolution," which probably is true. And Bukharin is executed. Now, why does this matter besides a tragedy for himself and his family, even though he's a completely loyal communist? But there are some communists who are seeing these show trials for what they are. Now, by the way, some deeply committed communists watch these show trials and they swallow these kangaroo courts, even though the evidence is clearly staged, even though these confessions are clearly brought about by torture and duress and threats. There's quite a few deeply committed communist or naive Western observers who admire Russia, who swallow these trials and think, man, Russia's got a lot of spies, a lot of traitorous activity by some of its former Bolshevik leaders. It's surprising, but Lenin's dealing with them. I get it. He's got to deal with these traitors. I would argue, though, that more perceptive international observers and more perceptive communists themselves see through this complete sham and a joke of justice and realize what these trials exactly they are. They're complete kangaroo courts. It's not about justice. It's about execution and doing so in a public manner. Good example of that one, a classic one. You guys would know him well too. Arthur Koestler, who famously wrote his classic Darkness at Noon. Arthur Koestler, deeply committed communist, but watches the show trials in Russia, the purge in Russia, and is deeply disturbed and sees it for what it is, and goes from being a very committed communist to writing one of the most impactful anti-communist books, Darkness at Noon, which you guys see in front of you. I mentioned this book at the start of the semester. I read this book in college, and it hit me. It's a powerful book. I think I mentioned, I won't go into it because of time, but again, he is recreating interrogations. Now it's fictional, but based on, in general, real events taking place in Russia, even though his work is a work of fiction. And he has not mentioned Stalin in that book. But clearly it's Stalin's Russia. It's clearly a Marxist interrogator who's interrogating the main character. Where's his name? Where's his name? Rubashov. Yes. There, yeah, Rubashov. An old Bolshevik. Good guy in the story. Rubashov is a deeply committed Bolshevik. He is not disloyal to the party at all. In fact, he is not, when he's arrested, he's not like some of these communists who are questioning what Stalin's done. He's just like, yeah, I'm a revolutionary. I'm a committed communist. I'm a committed Marxist. But that's not enough to protect him. And through that series of books, as Koestler explained, he is interrogated, and the book ends with him getting a bullet in the back of the head in the middle of the night. It's powerful. I recommend that to you guys. And you'll get to know a little bit of Arthur Koestler because you guys are reading him this week. And then also, as you guys know, you don't know them yet, but you'll read him a little bit in the context of the Spanish Civil War. We'll come back to Koestler, where Koestler is becoming a very strong anti-communist from being a former believer. For those who are not shot right away in the various mini prisons throughout Stalin's Russia, then you're sent to the Gulag, which is imprisonment and a work camp. So the Gulag are this whole massive system. You see massive, look at all the camps. All throughout Russia, these various work camps where you're sent as your prison sentence. I don't want you simply rotting away in prison, although they have those prisons too. But oftentimes in Russia, they send you to a work camp. Now again, it's a prison where you're expected to work. So you might get some tasks, whether that's chopping wood, whether it's mining, various tasks, these work camps you have to perform under very poor conditions. Very limited food, limited medical care, very harsh living conditions, poor medical care, and so the death toll in these labor camps probably is intentionally very high. So the fact that you go in the Gulag, there's no guarantee you're coming back. Now some do. So being sent in the Gulag isn't necessarily a death sentence, although for many, many, many Russians it is. Because the working conditions are so harsh, the food is so minimal, life there is so bleak, the physical privations, all of that contribute to a very high death rate in the Gulag. Once you guys know Alexander Solzhenitsyn, he's probably the single most famous survivor of the Gulag to write about his experience profoundly, although he's not the only one. I'll mention some already. But Russian novelist, becomes a very prominent dissident, outspoken critic of communism, having been a victim himself. Again, as a younger person, deeply committed communist, but witnesses things. Eventually, he is sent to the Gulag because a letter he wrote criticizing some of Stalin's policies, a private letter, by the way, but censored, found, sent to the Gulag for this. Eventually, he's able to survive, get back. There he is in the Gulag on the right. There he is in 74 on the left. And he'll write extensively about this terrible Russian prison system in a series of books called The Gulag Archipelago. Classic books, 3 volumes there. It's a heavy lift there, but they're classics. He also, maybe some of you guys read this in high school, I don't know, but One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which is a classic too. Just one day, the whole book is just one day of a man in the Gulag. What is his day like? That book, it might be a really good introduction to Alexander Solzhenitsyn. The Gulag is a heavy lift, right, a very depressing lift, and the 3 volumes might be a bit to ask. But probably his One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich probably is a good introduction to who Alexander Solzhenitsyn is and the very bleak, tragic reality of life in Stalin's gulags in Russia. We're getting close to the end right here, but I want you guys to know this lady right here, Urosina Krasnovskaya, and I did my best with her name. I'm not sure that's right. She would also be sent to the Gulag. She's a quite talented cartoonist, and she eventually would, I think, but while in the Gulag itself, would create these and hide these, and maybe after she got out too, but created a visual, graphic depiction of life in the Gulag in all its terrorized inhumanity. Both arriving there in the Gulag, the terrible conditions. You see a picture right here of 2 inmates talking to each other. You can see the emaciated level of that person who likely is going to die soon because they're so emaciated from lack of food, medical care, probably medical issues as well too. That's the picture of her when she's given her sentence. She has nothing to say. She knows there's no way out, and now you're going into this system in which you may not survive. There's a stamp of Moldova where she was from, recalling her contribution for 12 years in the Gulag and all the notebooks she kept. Depiction of people arriving in the Gulag, being stripped of their clothes and being deloused. You see the freezing condition, going in that work camp, being sent naked into the room to be inspected for security and then deloused. The idea of a welcome to the Gulag. Eventually, again, she would survive and she'd recall her events. Tragically, I think her books are not available in English. So I thought they would be. I'm surprised, but I do not. I could be wrong. Maybe they're old editions, but I looked last night on Amazon. I could not find her books, her notebooks in English. But again, that just gives you kind of a visual example of the horrors of the Gulag. All right. Why did Stalin send so many to their deaths? Especially so many of these being part of the Communist Party. Again, you can understand, I suppose, in a very tyrannical way why he eliminated some potential rivals. Again, that doesn't explain the morality of it. There is no morality to it. It's dark. But why so many loyal communists, many loyal communists who have served and sacrificed immensely for the Soviet cause, for Marxism, for communism, and them ended up dead. So it may be hard to ask. Certainly, this is one way for Stalin to crush any opposition because anyone who would even think about opposing him is probably already dead. And anyone who potentially could do this is likely to be dead or exiled. So it does, I suppose, in a sense, protect his power. So maybe that's the simplest reason. Significance, of course, the Russian army, who many generals are executed, is deeply weakened. It does strengthen Stalin's grip on power naturally, and subsequent dictators around the world follow this. Stalin would do similar things too in China. Now, memorials today to all this lost humanity are not as widespread as they should be because Russia, although Russia is aware to some degree of Stalin's worst deprivations and his inhumanity, it still is uncomfortable in many ways. So there are monuments to the victims of these great purges in the Gulag, but not on the way that you think they would be based on just the terrible numbers involved. But there are some. Ironically, the one on the left you're looking at is in the Ukraine, which makes complete sense. That's in Donetsk. Although Donetsk today is being occupied by Putin. But again, we're calling for the Ukraine, the terrible number of Ukrainians who are killed in these purges. Over 100,000 Ukrainians are executed. On the right, this is when Russia is beginning to open up during the very end of Gorbachev's time in power. You can see a wall of sorrow. You see the first exhibition of victims of Stalinism in Moscow. That's 1988. And of course, you see people sad as that lady with her hand on her face, because you would know people who disappeared into the meat grinder of Stalin's Great Purge and the Gulag and the show trials. And finally, we're at the end here. Sources on Stalin's purges and Gulag. Anne Applebaum is a fantastic journalist, historian. This book is relatively recent. It's much more accessible than Alexander Solzhenitsyn's 3 volumes, although, again, knock yourself out. But Anne Applebaum would be a really good introduction to the Gulag. That's a modern history and it's accessible. George Orwell's Animal Farm, which you guys probably know quite well, of course, is an encapsulation of all we're talking about, from the initial revolution under the February Revolution all the way to the October Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, Lenin, Stalin, sideline of Trotsky, eventually the murdering of Trotsky and Stalin's orders, along with many others, and Stalin's code of personality, and all that is played out, as you guys know, in George Orwell's masterpiece, Animal Farm. There's Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon, again, a wonderful classic. And then some other books that I recommend to you guys. Journey into the Whirlwind, Claude McLaren memoir of Stalin's Reign of Terror. That's by Eugene, it's like Ginsburg. That's a relatively recent book. Robert Conquest has been gone for a while now, but a brilliant historian. His book, The Great Tear, if you want to focus just on the tear, that's probably the classic you want to turn to, even though that book is now quite old. You see its 40th anniversary edition, but it's still very good. And then Donald Rayfield, Stalin and his Hangmen, The Tyrant and Those Who Killed for Him. A grim read. All these are grim reads, but if you want to dig in deeper into any of these topics, those would be some really good sources. And with that, we better wrap this up. We are out. So hope all you guys are doing well. I thank God for the freedoms we live, and we need to arm ourselves with the reality of what's happened to do our best to maintain the strength of our democracy, which is kind of grim at the end of this lecture, but it's nonetheless real. So I hope you guys are doing good. We better stop right here. So take care, everybody.